For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kimberly Goody. I've been working at Mandiant for the last nearly 7 years now. And for this whole entire time, I've been focusing on financially motivated cybercrime threats. And for the last 4 years, I've had the privilege of being able to direct the team that does all of the cybercrime analysis at our company. Oh, thank you. Whenever I am not working, you can usually find me out somewhere venturing around the world, swimming with fish, hiking some mountain, doing some sort of active adventure.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Stark, and I manage our team's amazing threat analysts. We also have some tech analysts that have contributed to the content in this presentation. And in my professional life, I like talking about attribution and data modeling and going down one too many analytical rabbit holes. In my personal life, I like obsessively planning vacations, consuming fine food and beverages, and taking various ag courses in a multi-year mission to convince Mr. Stark that we are going to move to a farmette. So if you really like living in the country, you can follow up with him later about how wonderful the country living is.
All right, so as Katie mentioned, today we are going to talk about a malware called shell sting. The rest of the community really knows this malware as Bumblebee, but of course we all have different names, so sorry about that. Whenever I refer to shell sting, I am actually talking about Bumblebee. So let's look at the activity kind of timeline that we see here. Whenever Bumblebee first became really public, that was via a blog post that was posted by Google back in March of this year. Proofpoint followed up with some research on that as well in April, and that really did coincide with when we started seeing shell sting start appearing at our managed defense customers in a more widespread way. This did coincide with the timing of when Bazaar Loader activity did stop, which is interesting, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But one of the interesting things when you look at this data at large, looking specifically at the compile times, and yes, we know these can be spoofed, but when we looked at the shell sting samples, the oldest compile time that we identified in our holdings was in late June of 2021. And so when you think about this in a trajectory of a development cycle for a piece of malware, that's not that inconsistent with what we've seen in other cases. So for example, Bazaar Loader, another malware that many of you are familiar with, that there is evidence from some of the leaked data that is available that the development of that malware began approximately at least 5 months prior to when it began to be actively distributed in more widespread campaigns. So this brings me to my next point. There are a bunch of different reasons that we do believe that shell sting is acting as a replacement for Bazaar Loader by at least a subset of actors who were using it previously. First, here, which I already mentioned, is kind of the timing. We saw Bazaar Loader stop being actively distributed in February of this year, and then in March is when we start to see this more widespread distribution of shell sting. This did also coincide with the very public and well-known Conti leaks, which is possibly another indication, if we presume that this might be acting as a replacement, that maybe this malware was kind of put into production earlier than they initially had intended it to be. The second notable overlap here that we saw with shell sting in Bazaar Loader initially was the way in which it was distributed. A lot of the ways that we saw Bazaar Loader being delivered were now delivering shell sting back during that time in March and April of this year. So we saw these stolen images campaigns. For those who aren't familiar, this is when the threat actor is using the contact forms on the web pages. They are filling that out and sending you a link via that way to ultimately download malware into your environment. We also saw overlaps with the DocuSign theme campaigns that were using OneDrive links, as well as ISO file campaigns that contained link files that had a lot of the similar attributes that we saw in prior Bazaar Loader, as well as other malware. But that indicated to us that these were likely developed or created on a common machine. The next overlap, which is, I guess, a little bit less publicly known, is through a particular panel that is used to manage the victims of shell sting. And so what we saw here is that, actually, let me back up a little bit. So we have this bots panel that is used to manage the shell sting infections. So let me tell you a little bit about that first and the functionality so that we're all on the same page. For those of you who look at malware admin panels all the time, this isn't really going to be that exciting to you, but some folks in the room probably aren't as familiar. And so this particular panel has really basic functionality. There's admin users and there's regular users. An admin user has the ability to add certain users to specific groups. And both the admin users and regular users have the ability to view victims. And for these victims, there is various information such as the operating system of the victim, the group ID that it is assigned to, when it was first infected, when it was last active, as well as comments that the threat actors may leave, and whether it's joined to a domain or not. Users can also upload files through this panel, so they can instruct, or they can do kind of like a wildcard, and they can basically instruct the download of a secondary payload across all the victims contained within this panel, but they can also be more specific. So they can say, we want to download X file onto, this particular group or onto this specific victim. So they can get as granular as they want with it. And over time, we've actually identified several different shell sting panels. These have run concurrently, and one of the interesting things is that the group IDs, which may correspond to or equate to some of the distribution campaigns and vectors that are occurring, those have largely been unique per each of these panels. So we are starting to see a little bit of overlap in those now, but it is interesting to see that those are largely unique. And across all of these panels, we have seen nearly 40 different users associated with them, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But back to one of the original points here, right? We're looking for overlaps between Bazaar Loader and shell sting to try to say more definitively whether or not this might be a replacement. And so what we actually saw back in mid-2020 was this bots panel appeared back then on Anchor command and control servers. But rather than displaying victims of shell sting, it was actually displaying victims of the Anchor DNS variant. And Anchor also has an overlap or tie to Bazaar Loader. It was created within the same ecosystem, arguably, within the same development group that created TrickBot and Bazaar Loader are also behind Anchor as well. But we have also seen Bazaar Loader infections that have materialized into ransomware or extortion operations where Anchor was also deployed to help enable those operations. So to recap, the things that we covered here that we identified as overlaps thus far was the timing, the campaign distribution, and then also the overlaps in this administration panel.
So you probably won't be surprised when I tell you that the vast majority of payloads distributed by these panels have been Beacon. But we do have some other payloads here. We've seen Sliver and Metasploit. I guess is Glider still around? We have Vidar, or however you pronounce it. And then we have a loader for IcedID that we track as SLEUTHCON. And so there are some similarities across these panels, but we also have some notable differences. In terms of similarities, we have observed the exact same Metasploit payload distributed by all 4 panels. We've also observed beacon samples configured to connect to the same C2 server across the 4 panels. But as you can see, we've only seen SLEUTHCON delivered by that one panel. And what this could suggest is that what we're seeing here is multiple distinct but closely affiliated actors that are working together to monetize access. And if that's true, we would expect to see some pretty significant differences in the post-compromise TTPs. And that's pretty consistent with what we've seen with TrickBot-affiliated ransomware actors, in which case they might be deploying the same ransomware, but using pretty different techniques afterwards. The other thing I'd like to go over quickly on that slide is just that we did, as Kimberly mentioned, we saw some campaign ID overlaps between these recently, and that supports the theory that all these panels are being run by the same threat groups, and they're probably routing some traffic between these servers. And this could be something pretty simple, like they're running a load balancer, but it means that there's a little less certainty that the payloads distributed by a specific server were uploaded via the corresponding panel. So here what we see is the number of unique payloads broken out by month and malware family. And I'd like to point out that this does not necessarily equate to volume of activity. We have some correlation, but there are a lot of other things that could happen here. So for example, what we do see sometimes is that actors are testing out different cryptors or different configurations of cryptors, and so they might upload a bunch of test files. But this is still interesting because you can see in the beginning we're starting out with just Beacon, and then we have a diversification of payloads, and we're going back to just seeing Beacon at this point. So you might be asking why. The short answer is I don't know. But we do regularly see actors trying different post-exploitation frameworks. And so that could be what we're seeing with Metasploit and Sliver. They tried them out, they got too many detections, or they just didn't like working with them, they didn't have the functionality, and they went back to Beacon. Oh, and it could also just mean that we've had some different users using the shelf sting accesses. So that previous slide is all the payloads we've seen directly from shelf sting infections. And to reiterate, it shows that we have multiple clusters. Now what we're going to go over on this slide is some other files associated with one of the clusters. So in October, we identified a shelf sting staging server that hosted a variety of legitimate and malicious tools used for post-exploitation activity. On the post-exploitation framework side, we saw Sliver and we saw Beacon, and we also saw the implant component of BRUNCHCON, which we track as Bold Badger. We also saw installers for AnyDesk and TeamViewer, and some PowerShell scripts that install ngrok, and then they create a tunnel where they expose the local RDP server. And talking about tunnelers, there was a build of a variant of the Legolo tunneler, and then we had just a bunch of regular old recon and privilege escalation tools like Mimikatz and Nessus, and just a variety of like normal things, right? What we didn't see here are any tools used for monetization. But what I would say is these tools are very consistent with what we'd expect to see with ransomware and data theft extortion actors. And so that brings us to the question, what are these actors doing that are using these accesses? Well, the truth is that Mandiant hasn't observed significant follow-on activity after shelf sting intrusions yet. And if you look at open source reporting, there actually isn't a lot on monetization. But when you look at the overlaps between shelf sting activity and Bazaar Loader and the use of things like the iced ID loader, I think we've all come to the same conclusion. These are extortion actors, likely using ransomware. And in June, Symantec released a blog post where they did in fact say that they've seen shelf sting lead to quantum. So what you're seeing here is an attack lifecycle I put together based on their blog post. And it's kind of interesting because it kind of suggests that there wasn't a lot of post-compromise activity. And they went in, they didn't really mention any lateral movement or privilege escalation, no data theft extortion or exfiltration. They just went ahead and deployed Quantum, which, as you can see there, we track as a rebrand of Mount Locker. Now, there was another post by Cyber Reason, I believe, in August, that had more robust post-compromise activity, including data theft, extortion with Arclone, but interestingly, no ransomware deployment. And if you go back to what we said earlier about post-compromise TTPs possibly or likely varying, this is a sign that that might be what's happening here. Other than that, I would say that former Conti affiliates in general have moved to a lot of different ransomware families. And given these overlaps that we've talked about with the TrickBot ecosystem and the fact that Conti and Ryuk, things like that, are ransomware families affiliated with that ecosystem, it's certainly likely that post-compromise activity would lead to ransomware families other than Mount Locker.
All right, so at this point, you probably wouldn't be very surprised if we told you that many of the 40 or so users that we've seen associated with the shell sting administration panels were actually possibly present in a lot of the leaked rocket chats in the Jabber server that appeared as a result of what is known as the Conti leaks. Approximately 10 of those usernames were actually direct one-to-one matches to users that appeared in those leaks. And there are another 10 that appear to be possible abbreviations of users. So to give you one example, there's a user named Giovanni in some of the leaked chat data. And within the shell sting administration panel, we've seen a user that is Geo. Now, is this the same person? I can't say with 100% certainty without some additional evidence, but it's a reasonable assumption that some of these could be abbreviated from longer monikers that existed elsewhere previously. So discussions associated with some of these actors within the Conti leaks are relatively limited, I would say, but there is some additional context that does just show you that these actors do have a history of being involved in various ransomware operations over time. So these are just a couple examples. We saw the actor White be present within one of the Rocket Chat servers. And we saw this actor specifically who was looking for support in using Print Nightmare. So they had put out a post and it was like, does anybody have a solution for exploiting this Print Nightmare vulnerability? This was a particular Jabber or Rocket Chat server rather that we actually did see the actors deploying multiple ransom variants. So we saw both Conti and Diavol being discussed in that particular Rocket Chat server. Another interesting actor is Shaved. This particular actor actually sought help with locking a network that was using Sophos products. And so they were just posting looking for support. And then finally, the actor Jack, we also did see reference by one of the leaders of the intrusion teams named Rosetka. They had asked Alter, who was the admin of the particular Rocket Chat server, if they could create this user. And there was one other interesting reference to Jack, which takes us back to the bootleggers or bazaar loader panels. There was a particular request by an actor who I believe it was Derek in this particular case, and they said, you know, can you give Jack access to G8? G8 is one of the group IDs that we actually saw within the bootleggers or bazaar loader panels. So now that we talked about some of the actors in the follow-on activity, we want to look and circle back to what we've seen in terms of trends more recently with this particular malware family.
So we actually saw shell sting in the wild first in 2021, but as Kimberly mentioned earlier, it was not widely distributed until 2022 after the Conti and TrickBot leaks. And those leaks may have, made the malware bit get rolled out a little bit sooner than they were planned, but since then the developers have come out with a lot of different updates. So for example, in that initial wave in March, we saw a bunch of new commands released. For example, there were commands for injecting shellcode or a DLL into a legitimate exe, or to deploy a downloaded binary via scheduled task. And in the coming months, we saw a bunch of other things released, like they added support for multiple C2 servers, a bunch of anti-analysis and evasion techniques, and a lot of those were borrowed from other projects. So the evasion code was from Ramnet, and we saw anti-analysis and anti-sandboxing code from a public source code repository, I think Alcazar. But the biggest change, in my opinion, is in September when we saw them introduce plugin support. And so far, the only plugin we've observed is for stealing credentials from Chrome-based browsers. But the fact that they bother to put in a plugin module or suggests that we might see more modules. And in particular, I would suspect that we'd see things for reconnaissance and credential theft. The fact that we continue to see this development over time suggests that shell sting itself is going to be around for at least the near term.
Another trend that we've seen in the last couple months is this increasingly or seemingly increasing number of ways in which the shell sting malware is actually being delivered. One of the more notable ways, I think, was a really great blog that Microsoft put out talking about the Raspberry Robin botnet, which Mandiant tracks as UNC 3840. And they saw shell sting be delivered via this particular botnet. And what's interesting here, too, is that they also noted that Iced ID was delivered via UNC 3840. And Iced ID is one of the secondary payloads that we also saw being delivered following shell sting infections in the summer of this year. And this might tell us that there is a common operator who is behind both of these varied distribution mechanisms. We also saw just this week, great timing, with Emotet delivering shell sting. And one of the questions that we often ask ourselves when we start to see these varied distribution techniques being used to deliver a common malware is, why is that? Are they doing this themselves? Are they seeking partners? And this tweet that we reference here is speaking to a basically spam message that was put out via Jabber. These actors are claiming to be associated with Bumblebee, aka shell sting, and they are looking for spammers who can distribute their malware. What's interesting here is that this is consistent with the solicitations that we saw for Bazaar Loader help. So to give one example of that, in June of 2021, there was an actor named Trafs, probably pronouncing wrong, that was operating in a Russian language underground community. And that actor was seeking installs in the US and Europe. And that actor, if you were someone who was a prospective partner, they would actually give you access to the Bazaar Loader panel, and they would assign you a group ID. And so, what we've seen historically with Bazaar Loader, this solicitation for partners who can actually deliver the malware for them so that they're not doing that aspect of their operations is something that appears to be consistent here with shell sting as well. One of the things that I would note here is that it's possible that we will continue to see these varied infection chains delivering shell sting. However, it's also reasonable to assume that once they identify the most reliable partners where they have success and that are financially secure relationships for them that they can rely on, that the number of varied distribution channels might decline over time to just focus on those particular partnerships that are the most fruitful for them. One broader trend that we also wanted to point out here is that we have seen actors shifting to more purpose-built tools. So you saw this with the actors who were using TrickBot and all of its modules to enable post-exploitation activity. They gradually shifted to using Empire and then settling on Beacon over time. And this is something that we appear to be seeing in the initial access phase as well. So most notably, we see this with TrickBot and Bazaar Loader. TrickBot was a very complex malware. It had a bunch of different modules that allowed it to be flexible, and it could be used for lots of different types of activity throughout the attack lifecycle, to moving to Bazaar Loader, which is a more simple loader and backdoor combination, Bazaar Loader and Bazaar Backdoor. And this malware seems to be, primarily focused on gaining access, doing system profiling of the victims that it has, and then allowing the actors to distribute these secondary payloads. And we kind of see this evolution here with shell sting as well. So shell sting, while we can't discount the fact that maybe it was hastily thrown into production and maybe they intend for additional features to be there in the future, but when you do the comparison point here, it does seem to be a lot more simplistic as well, and it seems to be only intent to gain that initial access and then allow the actors to deploy whatever their secondary payloads they may choose. And so this flow of events does seem somewhat strategic. Obviously, I'm not the threat actors, but it does seem like it's possibly an intentional decision by them to create this more simplistic malware. So we can't say for sure what the future holds, but this is one trend that we are seeing in this space right now. And with that, we are all done. But I also did want to give a random shout out. So Chris here from Mandiant is in the front row, and I would just say that the Mandiant folks are really awesome about showing up at these events and sitting in the front row so that we all feel more comfortable. It's so nice to look out and see a friendly smiling face. So thank you to Chris and all the other people here who are here to show support. And with that, John, I think it's off to you.
All right.